Welcome to all of you to this second session of our conference. It would have been very nice to have us all in person at the end of March and early April 6 months ago, but we're very grateful as well for you to be present in this environment, in this setting, and we're grateful to today's presenters. Today we will hear talks, as we did last week, for about 20 minutes each, giving us about 10 minutes each for some questions and discussions after the speakers are finished. So without further ado, I think we'll just start with our first speaker. Professor Brad Malkovsky teaches at the University of Notre Dame in the theology department in the areas of systematic theology and world religions, world church. He's an expert on Hinduism and especially Christianity and Hinduism in interreligious conversation and comparative theological perspectives. Besides his many published books, he was the editor of a journal on Hindu-Christian theology for a number of years. He's lucky enough to be a neighbor in the neighborhood of Professor Reynolds and me on our second floor in the theology department. Brad, we're really glad you're here, and thank you very much for your talk in advance, and we look forward to it.
Thanks so much. Can you all hear me okay? Yes? Okay, I'm going to hope that this is going to work now, the share screen. Here we go. So are you looking at a PowerPoint now? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, okay, because Paul said something, Paul's, I don't know if he's muted. Anyway, I don't want to do concluding. So Sri Ramakrishna and Sri Ramana Maharshi, two modern Hindu saints. So I'm a little bit worried right now because I want to do two saints instead of one. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to give a sense of the variety of people that we call saints in Hinduism. They represent sometimes very, very different kinds of theologies and experiences. So I chose these two in particular because they're very different, but also because these two are among the most beloved of all modern Hindu saints. So before I talk about them individually, let me make some general observations about Hindu saints. The first thing is you notice the word Shri in front of each of their names. This is not their formal name, this is an honorific title, and it means revered or venerable. So that's why you see this. In another context, Shri refers to the goddess Parvati, but that's a different kind of theology. Now there are indeed Hindu saints, but I'm going to be reading a lot of this, but Hinduism is itself, it's an ambiguous term. And a lot has been discussed in the recent decades about whether Hinduism as such really exists, because it really isn't anything monolithic. But it includes many understandings of the divine, Hinduism does, many ontologies, many ideas about spiritual liberation and how to attain it. Thus, there are many kinds of Hindu saints with many different teachings. There is no official Hindu process formally declaring a person a saint. It's just by general acclaim. Miracles are helpful, not required. Then there's the added difficulty of distinguishing saints from what we call avatars or divine incarnations. In the strictest sense of the word, avatars are not saints. They are God in creaturely form. So we think of avatars like Krishna and Rama and even some animals. And nowadays, more and more Hindus are willing to recognize that Jesus himself is one of the avatars, but he's not the most important one, but he's a great one. So they say Christians have one and they have many, okay. And an even broader modern understanding, all of us are potentially avatars. So that's a little bit of an introduction. Now we come to Sri Ramakrishna. There's a couple photos of him. This is one of the two most famous ones. He's standing there, he's teaching. Sometimes you see a photo of him where he's being held up because he's about to collapse from ecstasy because he's having another vision of the divine. So here he is right now. That's the last picture I have of him. I want to just talk a bit about him. I wonder, okay. Yeah, so I'll be now reading through this and commenting as I go. I'm going to talk about his life. I don't have a special frame for summarizing his teaching. I'm going to kind of weave that in here as I cover his life. So Ramakrishna was from Bengal. He's a Bengali. He lives his entire life in the Calcutta area. He lives from 1836 to 1886, so he doesn't live all that long. And we already get some sense as a boy that he has mystical inclinations. There's one famous story that when Ramakrishna is a 6-year-old boy walking through a paddy field, he's eating some kind of snack, and he looks up into the sky and he sees a flock of white cranes passing in front of a black thundercloud. And the visual coming together of the light and the darkness, both in forms of beauty, caused him to go into ecstasy and collapse on the ground. He had to be carried back to his home again. So he's someone who's seeing God in everything without having any kind of formal training about being able to do this kind of thing. I mean, to interpret what he's doing. And these experiences of ecstasy in different contexts are going to repeat themselves throughout his childhood. And then when he's 18 or 19 years old, after the death of his older brother, he's asked to take over the priestly duties at a Kali temple outside Calcutta. Kali is the Divine Mother. There's a lot of different names for the Divine Mother. Durga would be another one. She's seen to be the one who destroys evil and helps people reach the final goal. I was going to show you a very fierce picture of Kali, but I decided to pass on that. There's a picture of her with a garland of skulls around her neck, and there's blood dripping from her teeth. So she's motherly, but she's also fearsome. She represents the wild, untamable side and the unpredictable side of the divine. But Ramakrishna, who was not raised in the Kali tradition, when he takes over the priestly duties at the temple, he becomes more and more enamored of the pictures of Kali in the temple. And eventually, he just yearns to come to know her, to have a vision of the divine. He prays all the time. He can't eat his food. He doesn't sleep at night. He spends nights in the cemetery, doing anything to put himself in the presence of the divine apart from other people, groaning for her at all times. And finally, he reaches the day, he's about 19 or 20 years old, when he's totally in despair. He's gone mad with desiring her, to have a vision of her. And finally, he realizes it's not going to happen. He's not going to see her for whatever reason. He doesn't say why it might be. And so he thinks to himself, what's the point of living if you can't be united with God? And so he goes to one of the rooms of the temple where there's a sword, and he's about to kill himself with the sword when suddenly Kali reveals herself to him as an infinite ocean of consciousness and bliss, with wave upon wave of God washing over him as he lays on the ground. And he says afterwards, he says it as one of his primary teachings, one must yearn for God like a child yearns for her mother. You have to have that total focus on the divine. Shankara, another more ancient Hindu, says you have to desire the spiritual liberation to the exclusion of every other earthly desire. He's talking about liberation. Ramakrishna says you have to desire God. He's thinking here of God as person. Now, something else happens then. It's not like he's attained the final goal now with this first experience of the divine. He has a greater hunger now than ever, even though he has this consolation. He has a great hunger now to go deeper into the divine mystery. And providentially, for a number of years to come, different spiritual guides will be coming into his life to tell him about this or that particular Hindu spirituality or teaching. And in each case, he is indoctrinated, and maybe that's not a good word, but he is led into not only the teaching, but the experiential tradition of the kinds of Hinduism that he's being taught to understand. So Hindu Tantra, I'll look at my cursor here, Hindu Tantra, Vaishnavism, that means worship of Lord Vishnu, Advaita Vedanta, which is another way of speaking of non-duality. This is my area of Hinduism, Advaita Vedanta. And then he also meets a Sufi master he spends time with the Sufi master. He prays 5 times a day. He wears Muslim clothes. He learns much of the Quran, and he turns away from all the idols. They call those idols in Hinduism. it's not necessarily a bad word when you use the word idol. He tries to be as a Muslim as much as possible, and he claims that he has entered into the mind and the spirit of Islam. And then finally, he also says that he has entered into the true spirit of Christianity, although it was a very brief time, where he has the Bible read to him, the New Testament in Bengali. He learns about Christ. He's very enamored of Christ, and he's praying day and night to Christ. And one day, according to him, he has a vision of Christ who approaches him with radiance and compassion and gentleness, and then merges into him. So he has this lifelong love of Christ as well. So what do we learn then? Ramakrishna then is practicing very different spiritual paths, and through them he's attaining different experiences that validate that each of these religions is a way to God. He's doing it himself as this one person. Now we can be skeptical about this, that he's able to do all these different things, but that's one of the reasons why he's so famous, is because he has legitimized and validated and confirmed the value of all these different religions as ways to God, and he does not establish a hierarchy among them, which is higher, which is lower. Is the personal higher, or the impersonal understanding, the non-interactive understanding of the divine, is it higher? And basically he says they're all legitimate. He does seem to have a certain predilection for Kali, the mother, though. It's like all of these different ways are just ways in which Kali, the mother goddess, is being playful and revealing herself in these very, very different and sometimes conflicting and contradictory ways. So we get a sense of the richness of the divine from his manifold experience, testing out these other religions. Okay, so what does he want to do? He wants to talk about God, God, God all the time, and he wants people to be excited about God, like he is excited how he himself has been transformed by the experience of God. And he dies finally of throat cancer in 1886. Now, I also want to bring in here his most famous disciple, who was Swami Vivekananda. Now, not everybody has heard of this man, but Swami Vivekananda is the first Hindu missionary to the West. He was an immediate disciple of Ramakrishna. And he comes to the World Parliament of Religions in 1893. Where was that? You know where that was, 1893? Chicago. And the star at the Parliament of Religions is Swami Vivekananda. So just briefly want to tell you about Vivekananda's first meeting with Ramakrishna before he's Swami Vivekananda. Swami is a professed monk. And the last part of all the monks' names ends with Ananda, which means bliss, divine bliss. So this means the divine bliss of discriminating between what is most important and what is less important. That's what Vivekananda means. That was not his original name. When he first goes to Ramakrishna, he hears about this holy man, and he says, well, I'm kind of skeptical that there's anything like mysticism or the God experience. I want to meet this guy. So he goes to Ramakrishna, and they chat a little bit. And finally, Vivekananda asks him directly, sir, do you know God? And Ramakrishna says, yes, I do. Really? You know God? He's very skeptical. How real is God for you? And Ramakrishna says, you see, I see you standing in front of me. You're very real standing in front of me. God is much more real than that, than you standing in front of me, which made Vivekananda very angry. He thought this guy's an imposter, but he somehow fell under his spell, and he came back and became a disciple and a professed monk, and then off he goes to America. Okay, here now is the other person I want to talk about, a different path entirely. Sri Ramana Maharshi, who's closer to our times now, 1879 to 1950. And I will try to tell his story very briefly and the implications of that, and then the implications of the two of them for today, Ramakrishna and Ramana Maharshi. I'm keeping my eye on the clock. I think I got 5 or 10 more minutes. I don't know exactly. I'm probably talking too fast like I normally do, and I get excited about these things. But here's Ramana Maharshi. Now, a little bit about him. Unlike Ramakrishna, who's from the Calcutta area, he's from South India. He's a Tamil. And here's something very important. Unlike Ramakrishna, who we just heard about, Ramana Maharshi did not have a hunger to know God. He was a schoolboy. He liked playing soccer, right? And if people pushed him too hard, he'd push him back. He was kind of robust. One of the stories told about him that's quite remarkable is he would enter into very, very deep sleep at night. And the people in the village who didn't like him, his people his same age, they would pick him up off the ground and carry him through the village, banging pots and pans near his head, where he's, at the same time, he's totally asleep. He doesn't hear any of this. So it's an indication that he has a special kind of mind of great intensity. He's intense when he sleeps. He's totally oblivious to everything else. I don't know if this plays a role in his enlightenment or not. Anyway, so what happens then is that unexpectedly, at the age of 16 years old, some say 17, he's in his room, in his little house in South India, and all of a sudden, he has this sense that he's about to die. He doesn't know where this teaching or this intuition comes from. I'm about to die. Now, this is not preceded, this spiritual experience is not preceded by any kind of moral virtue cultivation, no spiritual hunger, no schooling in Hindu teachings, although he's raised in a Hindu home. He's not interested in religion, right? So he says to himself, well, what is this thing called death? What does this death mean for me? And spontaneously does what is called shavasana, which is the corpse position in yoga. He lies down and he doesn't move and he's flat on his back. And he starts to go through his body. He said, well, if this dies, does that mean that I'm totally dead? And how about if this is gone? And finally what happens, he comes to the realization, not through reasoning or any longer investigating his body, but suddenly through a flash of insight, what we would call an enlightenment, he suddenly is aware that he is deathless spirit, using his own words. Pure, unchanging, blissful consciousness. So this is not about relation with the Divine Mother that we have with Ramakrishna. This is awakening to a pure, blissful, serene consciousness beyond the lower, old identity of selfhood, right? And so after this experience, where he's now for the rest of his life, he's going to be in unshakable calm and bliss, he no longer refers to himself, or very rarely he refers to himself with the word I, since the normal understanding of I refers to the awareness connected to our ego and our body. And he's talking about a different awareness of selfhood. He says, if you follow the I to its source, the I you use every day, what will happen? He says, if you don't turn back out of fear as you see your old identity crumbling because of your investigation of what really the I refers to, if you follow it to its source, you'll find that the old idea of self, the old sense of self falls away, and all that remains is the divine I. And now you are the expression of that. He never presents this in a systematic way. He simply lives it, and he shows us the experience of transformation. So for 20 years now, he's living in silence. There's a story told that one of the first things he does is he wants to go to a mountain in South India called the Arunachala, which is supposed to be a special abode of Lord Shiva, one of the two most important names for the creator God and the God who rescues. And he comes to a temple at the bottom of the mountain, and he's completely unknown. He's like 16 years old. He's a scrawny little kid. Well, I don't know how scrawny he is. And there he is, and other kids start pelting him with stones when they see that he's meditating, like, oh, the guru, the sannyasi, who does this guy think he is? So he goes underground to the underground chamber there, and they're waiting for him, and he doesn't come out for 2 weeks. Doesn't eat or drink for 2 weeks. Finally, some real sannyasis or monks go down and they find him and they carry him up to the surface, and he's in total serenity, doesn't speak. What he is what they're aiming for in their own life, this union with the divine, or the awakening to the divine. And eventually what's going to happen is he will finally speak, and they're going to build an ashram or monastery around him. And then eventually the whole world finds out about him, and they come and they go on pilgrimage to him to ask him questions having to do with spiritual development. And often what he does is he takes the question and turns it back on the questioner and says, well, first of all, find out who is the I that's asking the question. And then you'll see whether or not your question is significant or not. Now, the kind of person he is described as being is always unassuming. He's never walking around saying, I am the teacher, listen to me. He's very humble, serene, compassionate toward all beings, from people down to animals and insects. And he humbly shares in the kitchen work at the ashram. Most of the time when he's not helping out in the kitchen, if he's not going for a walk, he's in a special hall they've created for him, his followers, and he's sitting on a couch doing nothing. And if people want to come, and there's always a hall full of people, and ask him a question, he might answer them and maybe he won't. And it said that his most effective teaching method was to simply be there before people in silence. And this eventually leads to a very famous Catholic monk coming under his spell as well, named Swami Vivekananda. Some of you will know that name. All right, so that's a little bit about him. And I'll try to finish in about 2 minutes here. So again, I've talked mostly about the silence and about tracing the word I to its source, which had not been done before in such a simple way. Here's something to be aware of also. The experience of non-duality is normally understood in Hinduism's most famous sampradaya or tradition called Advaita Vedanta as requiring a lot of different requirements. A certain caste, it used to be a certain gender, male. You had to belong to a certain lineage. You had to know scripture very well. Ramana Maharshi says, no, this is for anybody if they just look at the state of their own mind and trace their first pronoun singular to its source. So here's now some concluding observations about this. I wish I had a whole hour. So some concluding observations about these two saints. Both saints were lifelong celibates, and there's no trace of sexual impropriety attached to them, unlike some other Hindu saints or Hindu teachers. I was in an organization for a while when I was in my 20s where there was a big problem with the master. Both saints treated all people with equal dignity and compassion, regardless of gender, regardless of caste. Both saints outgrew traditional Hinduism by expanding it to all people, the teachings. Their messages were therefore non-sectarian. They were directed to all people, regardless of religious affiliation. You didn't have to switch your religion to follow their teaching or be their follower. The focus was on the individual's spiritual attainment, on the experience of the divine and its liberating effect. It was not on the community or on social justice. This is not Gandhi. This is something different. Neither presented a systematic overview of their teachings. And then two more to go. Many contemporary Western spiritual guides and movements identifying as non-dualist will often cite the life and teachings of Ramana Maharshi as evidence that enlightenment is available to all people. So he's been gone 70 years, but the non-dualist movements, which are everywhere now, they're always referring back to Ramana Maharshi. And then finally, Ramana Maharshi influenced certain Catholic contemplatives in India, such as Swami Vivekananda and my friend Sarah Grant, who passed away about 20 years ago as well. So that's a lot to digest all at once. It's kind of just, skimming the surface, but that's basically my presentation. So maybe you have some questions, I don't know.
Thank you so much, Brad. And glad to have people use the hand raising for questions, also for applause. So, but if you have a question, I'll try to keep an eye on you. Would someone like to ask a question of Brad?
It's fine if you don't. Silence is a very good thing.
Catherine.
Paulinus. Oh, sorry, did Catherine have somebody?
Yeah, Catherine had her hand up, then.
Go ahead, Catherine.
Catherine, please.
Just a quick question about the very last thing you said about his influence on Sarah Grant. Can you say a little bit more about that? How precisely and what Sarah drew from him? Catherine,
did you ever meet Sarah Grant?
I did.
I thought you did, yeah. I lived with Sarah Grant in her ashram. She's a famous Scottish nun. Sarah Grant is, her connection to non-duality or Advaita was basically through Shankara. She did her dissertation on Shankara, and she was very influenced by a Belgian Jesuit named Richard de Smet, who was also my informal or unofficial guide in India for these things. But I know that she, at first, was very much turned off by the teaching of Ramana Maharshi when she first came. It wasn't systematic enough for her. And gradually, I don't know how it happened, she came more and more under the influence of the teaching of Ramana Maharshi. And I remember one time she said to us, as she was leaving her ashram, she was the acharya or co-head of the ashram where I was living for a while. She says, I'm going now to Tiruvannamalai. This is the place where Ramana Maharshi had been living, this ashram. And I said, what are you going to do? She says, I just want to sit. I just want to sit. So she wants to imbibe the spirit of him. Now, there's another way indirectly that she's influenced by Ramana Maharshi is through her good friend Abhishektananda. We know that Abhishektananda, this very famous Catholic monk, his name means the bliss of Christ. He's a Frenchman. He's the one who is thrown completely off balance by his encounter with Ramana Maharshi. He doesn't speak to him, but he's impacted by the spirit, where he has to go deeper now, a more radical interior renunciation of self than he had ever experienced before as a Benedictine monk in a monastery for 20 years in France. He didn't quite know what to do with Abhishektananda. And so the rest of his life is wrestling with very different experiences of the divine. One relational, traditional Christian, focusing on love, and the other one of the complete annihilation of all relations. And so because Sarah Grant was a friend of Abhishektananda, it's easy to see why she came under the influence of Ramana Maharshi indirectly. That's how I would answer the question. Did you have a follow-up to that, Catherine?
Thanks, Brad.
No, I was just curious.
Zhu Ying Wan, please.
Okay, yes, first of all, thank you for a fascinating lecture. I just have two very brief questions. First one, how's the saintlyhood in Hinduism tied to the renouncer tradition? So it seems like these two saints that you mentioned, they are both renouncers, is that right?
Yeah, let me answer that question first.
All right.
Do you mind if I can do that? So they didn't formally renounce. They didn't. Normally, the renouncer traditions means that you undergo a ritual with the help of a teacher, and then you are officially a renouncer, a sannyasi or sannyasini, right? They didn't do that. So they're outside that tradition. That's why I said they're going beyond traditional Hinduism. And also, because we don't have a formal process of canonization, we're able to say that certain individuals are saintly, and maybe saints, even though they're not renouncers. For example, it's been often said that the parents of certain famous modern Hindu teachers were themselves saints, although not recognized by Hindus far and wide as such, but they were saints. So the term is very, very fluid, okay? It can be used for family people as well as for people who are monks and nuns. So what's your second question?
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. The second one is you mentioned that the second saint, the name I can't remember.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. People actually built a monastery around him. So could you say a little more about like a Hindu monasteries? Is there a clear structure as like a Buddhist monastery, a Catholic monastery, or is this like a more loosely organized?
I can't speak to that. I don't know much about architecture. But normally at a monastery, I mean an ashram, which is like a monastery, there's definitely going to be a sanctum, a place where God especially dwells in a special way, making God self-present to the people. The real heart of the ashram is going to be the guru, right? Regardless of the kind of structure. Now, in Ramana Maharshi's ashram, I don't know if they have that at all, because he was there, he was the one, he embodied the divine. And so you didn't need to have a special kind of iconography or whatever. I know that now that he's gone, I've not been there myself, but I've seen pictures. There are special places within the ashram where we have like objects that are associated with him. And I think there might even be pictures of him. But in other ashrams, you will find not just the teacher, but you will also find representations, symbolic representations of the divine. Other than that, I really don't know about the structure of them. But by the way, if you want to see some ancient Buddhist monasteries where they're no longer inhabited today, you can go to what are called the Ajunta Caves in India. I think that's been my high point in India, is going to these Buddhist monastery caves, not far from from Bombay or Mumbai, a couple hours away. So I don't think I did a good job answering that particular question, but.
No. Maybe I wasn't clear at all. I meant, like, for instance, in order to become a CSC priest, you have to go through all kinds of procedure. Like, what about for Hindu monasteries? Is it also like, this kind of like that sort of?
Well, then, I actually wish I could pull it up now. I just had a picture sent to me 2 weeks ago by a very famous Hindu monk who's written a very famous book on Ramana Maharshi as a philosopher. His name is Ayan Maharaj. He just took final vows. So I have a picture here, it's on my desktop, of him with 33 other monks, all wearing orange, and their teachers sitting in the front row and they're getting their blessing from him. So they go through a long period of training. But I don't know step by step what they have to do, but it is very formal. And there are rituals involved there. Okay.
Okay,
I
yeah.
really-
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
that's-
We have time for two quick questions. I'm going to ask the two questioners to ask them together and Brad to answer them together. And that'd be from Professor Odazor and Professor Durmaz. Professor Odazor first.
Brad, thanks. Two questions. You said that the title for saints was Sweet. Am I right?
I'm having a hard time understanding you, Paulinus.
Shri. The title for saints is Shri.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Okay. And how does one generally get to attain that title, and who confers it? And related to that is, do people of lower castes in India also ever attain that kind of title?
Great. Professor Durmaz.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. You mentioned in the case of Ramakrishna, him becoming meta-religious, like by experimenting with Islam and Christianity in 19th century India. So I was wondering if we can read this as an anti-colonial discourse, or if you can say a little bit about the political environment and how this hagiography may or may not fit into those broader colonial, like major colonial movements and the religion.
I'll start with yours first. Calcutta is famous for what they call the Hindu Renaissance, right? The inner renewal of Hinduism through the impact of the West. And so Christ is especially popular among certain intellectuals in Calcutta. And so I would assume that Ramakrishna, although he grew up in a village, he wouldn't have heard of Christ. He might have heard about Christ, I think only when this person was reading the Bible to him and talking to him about Christ. But I don't think that he was as directly impacted by the new Renaissance, the Indian Renaissance, as were other people. He didn't have a political bone in his body. His whole focus was on God, God, God. He wasn't interested in the social situation at all, unlike others of his time. He's been criticized for that, right? So in that sense, no, it's not a pushback against what was going on politically in that time. And Paulinus, I don't really know all the different titles that might be used for a saint, whether Shri is the only one. It's the one that I'm familiar with certain of these. And I don't think that there's a formal process by which a person is called Shri. But there's just this general understanding that so-and-so is a saint, and more people get on board with that idea. As for the low castes, India probably has more, I would guess that the most popular saints, outside of these two now, many of them are from the low castes. And this is what's interesting about the lower caste saints. The lower caste saints come from what we call the bhakti traditions of devotion. And what they did, they not only worshiped and prayed to a God of love and compassion, different names for God, different conceptions of God, but at the same time, they critiqued Hindu society and its caste system. So sometimes they talk like Hebrew scripture prophets. Woe to you, priests in the temple, or woe to you, yoga practitioners who neglect the widow and the orphan, right? So where these impulses come from is hard to say. But so the saints from the lower caste, they're very much in love with God, but they're also critiquing and thundering against the abuse of religion by those in power. It's very, very common. Okay.
Thank you very much, Brad.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you. We now turn to our second speaker, Professor Anne Astell, also of Notre Dame's Theology Department. Anne came to Notre Dame from Purdue University, where she taught a number of years. And she's been on the faculty, I think about 15 years or so, a real delightful colleague. We're grateful to her for joining us. Her area is the history of Christianity in our department. She's written a lot about medieval spirituality, hagiography through the ages. She's a very popular teacher here at Notre Dame, much beloved of undergraduates and graduate students alike. And I'm going to turn over to Anne. And Anne, tell me when you want me to put your PowerPoint up.
Right away.
Okay.
And I was worried about my timing, so I'm just going to do a lot of reading like Brad did, so to keep to the 20 minutes. All right, so the topic is Therese of Lisieux and the Communion of Saints. how does this work? Okay. According to the Jesuit theologian George Maloney, of all the doctrinal statements found in the Church's earliest creeds, the one stating our belief in the communion of saints is the one least understood among Christians, and therefore the one that has the least importance for practical Christian living. This dictum certainly does not apply to Saint Therese of Lisieux, the popular young Carmelite saint and doctor of the Church, whom Pope Pius X once hailed as the greatest saint of modern times. Her famous, confident little way of holiness, appealing to people in every way of life, might best be understood as the practical application of the 9th article of the Creed, I believe in the communion of saints. Just a picture of her, as a girl and then as a young nun. Her life rooted in a holy family, Therese lived in a remarkable constant communion of saints that paradoxically united her all the more closely with weak human beings, with sinners. With them and for them, she herself charitably strove for sanctity, in keeping with the Pauline word, none of us lives to himself, none of us dies to himself. The link between the communion of saints and the communion of sinners in her original experience helps to explain the striking modernity of her doctrine, which speaks to an age of global economies, mass transportation and communication, intersubjectivity, border crossings, and pandemic. At age 19, during the so-called Russian flu epidemic, she cared for and helped to bury her fellow nuns in the Carmel. In such an environment, individual persons experience themselves as limited, dependent upon others, uprooted, exposed, vulnerable. The genius of Therese's spirituality converted precisely human limitation into a holy childlikeness, uprooting into transplantation, and interdependence into the communion of saints. Pope Francis's canonization of Therese's parents, the opening also in 2015 of the cause of canonization of her sister Leone, the description of pious and affectionate family life found in Therese's story of a soul, the extant letters, the dying Carmelites' recorded last conversations with her sisters Pauline, Marie, and Céline, fellow Carmelites with Therese at the convent at Lisieux. These all provide evidence for Therese's holiness as something intimately shared with others and received from God through others. Just a couple of slides with family pictures. I'm not going to dwell on them, but it's wonderful to have a saint from the age of photography. As the Catechism of the Catholic Church instructs, the communion of saints is both that among holy people and in the holy things that build, express, and secure their relationship. The force of noble example, intercessory prayer, generously offered sacrifices, patient instruction and exhortation, sharing of charisms, reception together of the sacraments, the reading aloud of sacred texts in a communal setting, the exchange of symbolic gifts. For example, the little flower that Therese's father once gave to her as a blessing upon her vocation to Carmel. This communion in holy things names, in short, the graceful intermingling of the things of heaven and earth in everyday life. Therese's idea of the communion of saints was certainly grounded in her childhood experience of living in a holy natural family, but it extended beyond that to the communion of nuns with whom she lived, to the missionary priests in Africa and Indochina for whom she prayed and to whom she wrote, to people in every faith, and even through charity to the excommunicated, the atheist, the still unrepentant murderer. She offered her own love of God, her faith, and her hope for everyone, on everyone's behalf. Her idea of the communion of saints was so capacious that she excluded no one, because she found each and every person to be beloved by God as God's child. After her death, she wanted to cast flowers on everyone, the just and the sinners. In what she called the world of souls, Jesus' garden, she imagines the different kinds of souls as a great variety of flowers, including, quote, the poor savage who has nothing but the natural law to guide him, unquote. She suffered her own excruciating trial of faith during her final illness and solidarity with and for unbelievers, thinking in particular of a certain relative of hers who had lost the faith. Dying of tuberculosis at age 24, the young saint offered her last Holy Communion on August 19, 1897, for Father Hyacinthe Lauzon, an excommunicated priest, scandalous to his contemporaries, but in the eyes of Therese, still her brother. The little way of Saint Therese is sometimes summed up as doing ordinary things with extraordinary love. This motto is memorable and true, but it fails to communicate the profundity of her spirituality. As Therese understood and knew from experience, the individual human being is a small creature, weak and sinful, but especially loved by God as God's child. She found this divine predilection revealed in the infant Jesus and in the crucified Savior, whose holy face Therese venerated, especially after the physical disfigurement of her own father's face through a succession of strokes. Because God knows how weak the human person is, Therese reasoned, God's justice demands that God be merciful, mercy being the greatest of God's attributes. Bending down to lift the helpless child, the merciful arms of the Heavenly Father are revealed for Therese in the outstretched arms of the suffering Savior, whose love reaches unto folly, and who calls from the cross, I thirst. Willing the salvation of all, Christ thirsts for souls, whom he draws to himself and lifts heavenwards. The elevator which must raise me to heaven is your arms, O Jesus. The charity outpoured into the soul of Therese on Christmas Eve, 1886, manifested itself explicitly and immediately in her sharing in Christ's thirst. I wanted to give my beloved to drink. She thirsted for the conversion of a convicted murderer, Henri Pranzini, whom she called her first child. From her own experience, Therese thus learned a merciful hydraulics, so to speak, in the saintly life. In their communion with Christ, the saints thirst with him for souls, extending the reach of his mercy from age to age. Relying not on themselves but on the Father's mercy, they offer everything they do and suffer to Christ and with him for the sake of others. They renounce every merit and every claim to be rewarded, except the claim to God's mercy, which they seek to draw down upon themselves and others through confident childlike surrender. In their humility, these little saints, as Therese called them, know and understand that whatever good they possess has come to them from the Father above, but also through a host of people in heaven and earth who have loved, prayed, and sacrificed, thirsted for them in Christ. Nothing they have is their own. Everything belongs as gift received and gift given to the communion of saints. In her last conversations, Therese often spoke explicitly of the communion of saints, using a parable-like example of a sister who had lit her own candle and all the candles held by the others from the single dying flame of a half-extinguished little lamp. Therese explained, it's the same with the communion of saints. Very often, without our knowing it, the graces and lights we receive are due to a hidden soul, for God wills that the saints communicate grace to each other through prayer with great love, with a love much greater than that of a family, and even the thought that even the most perfect family on earth. How often, she continues, have I thought that I may owe all the graces I have received to the prayers of a person who begged them from God for me, and whom I shall know only in heaven. On another occasion, she muses that part of every individual's joy in heaven will be to know those who save them through their hidden prayers and sacrifices. The originality of Therese's understanding and application of the traditional doctrine of the communion of saints becomes evident when we consider her relation to members of the church in her, the meaning of the churches, traditionally recognized three states: that of the saints in glory, those already with God, and those of penitent saints, passively undergoing purification after death, and third, that of the saints in this present life, engaged in active spiritual warfare with the world, the flesh, and the devil. Discussing the intercession of the saints in glory for those still struggling, the Catechism of the Catholic Church actually quotes a saying of Therese, "I want to spend my heaven doing good on earth." In Therese's life, the saints in glory, so we'll do them one by one. In Therese's life and writings, one finds ample evidence of her devotion to canonical saints. And I won't read this long list. You can kind of just glance down the slide. A visionary dream she had of Venerable Anne, Mother Anne of Jesus, a Carmelite foundress who unexpectedly came to her and caressed her, consoling her in illness, confirmed Therese in her belief that the saints in heaven were calling her, thirsting for her company. "This is the way the saints know me, love me, smile upon me from above, inviting me to join them." She says she never had a devotion to that particular saint, but she certainly did after that vision. Hearing the sisters reciting the Confiteor on her behalf, Therese was moved. "Oh, they do well to beg pardon from all the saints. This is how God makes me feel when I'm little. It makes me happy." She told her sister Pauline that in heaven the saints share all their goods. "Just as a mother is proud of her children, so shall we be proud of each other, having not the least bit of jealousy." The idea of the saints in heaven as little relatives of hers was something very concrete for Therese, due to the early deaths of 4 of her siblings. Okay, the saints in purgatory. The Catholic Church recognizes communion not only with the saints in glory, but also with the holy souls undergoing purification in preparation for that glory. Therese shared this faith, and together with her Carmelite sisters prayed the office for the dead. Praising God's gentleness, Therese hoped that her ardent love for God and the suffering of her mortal agony would be her purgatory on earth, and open heaven immediately for her after her death. But she calmly contemplated the possibility of joining the souls in purgatory. "If I go to purgatory, I'll be very content. I'll do like the 3 Hebrews in the furnace. I'll walk around in the flames singing the canticle of love." She imagined further that God might allow her to suffer there in the place of other souls, thus doing good in purgatory and delivering captives. The saints in their earthly striving. Therese's experience of communion with the saints in glory and in purgatory seamlessly and organically extends her experience of loving communion with imperfect souls still on their earthly way. Her parents, sisters, schoolmates. She and her sisters experienced the tender love and care of parents without equal, who set a pious example for them. She was especially devoted to her father. Like her father, Therese's older sister Pauline was her ideal. In a hymn of gratitude, the dying Carmelite tells her sister, "All the great graces in my life I have received through you." And she says, "When I'm in heaven, I'm going to tell the truth. I'll tell all the saints it's my little mother who gave me everything that pleases you in me." On June 11th, 1895, at Therese's invitation, her sister Céline joins her in the convent in making a self-offering to God's merciful love, upon which they pledge to depend completely for their salvation, rather than upon any good works of their own, on God's merciful love. In place of their own merits, they offer Christ, together with all the merits of the saints in heaven and earth, their acts of love, and those of the holy angels. The idea of the communion of saints that gains expression in this prayer is an extraordinary one. Even as the first Christians renounced land, property, and possessions, holding everything in common, so too, Therese teaches, the saints hold in common their spiritual goods, mutually giving and thankfully receiving, keeping nothing for themselves, relying entirely upon the mercies of God, from whom comes every good and perfect gift. The little saints, envisioned by Therese, participate in God's goodness, knowing precisely the truth of Jesus' word, no one is good but God alone. Echoing the farewell discourse of Christ to his apostles and appropriating it, Therese teaches that the communion of saints with Christ, the saint of saints, entails a charitable participation in Christ's saving actions, his descent into the world, his dying, his rising, his ascent into glory, his coming again. Christ's thirst for souls, and therefore the thirst of the saints, is satisfied only through the homecoming of all the elect. For this reason, Therese maintains that after death, she herself will continue her mission on earth of making God loved. She will enter into eternal rest only at the end of time. Then I will take my rest. I'll be able to rejoice because the number of the elect will be complete, because all will have entered into joy and repose. That's the end.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks so much. We now welcome questions. Again, feel free to raise your hand electronically, or I'll try to keep an eye on you less than electronically or otherwise than electronically. Any questions for, yeah, Brad? We can't hear you, Brad.
And that was really wonderful. I really appreciate it. I don't know enough about St. Therese as I should, so I learned a lot today. One person you mentioned I did not know before, Hyacinth Loison, and that she prayed for him as the final person she prayed for. While you were talking, I kind of went online and I checked to see who this person was. And I would say that today we would say his theology is pretty good. He's very affirmative of Protestantism and Judaism. So do you know anything about Therese's own feelings about Protestantism? Was it, I mean, this man was very positive. Does she have any statements that you know of about Protestantism, good or bad?
Not to my knowledge, no. But I really got fascinated with her to think about the communion of saints, because it seems, especially given our topic, right, that it's, that's what we're talking about, right, the communion of saints, and that the goodness of anyone who's pursuing God, right, is going to be to the benefit of everyone else, and we won't even know it until, eternity, right? It's a beautiful thought.
Yeah, thank you.
Diane Stinton, please.
Yes, thank you so much for your paper. I really appreciated it very much. And I was especially struck by how expansive she was in praying for so many different kinds of people beyond her own community, including these very convicted murderers. So I was just wondering, is there any evidence of what impact her thirsting, her prayers had? You mentioned one on Henry Pranzini, on him or any others. How did people respond when they heard that she was praying for them in this way?
Well, Pranzini is the name of this convicted murderer, right? And he died by beheading, right, in a public execution. And he was unrepentant, right? Kind of almost up to the end, right? But, and Therese is just a little girl at this time, still a young teenager. But she has been praying very faithfully to him, and she's reading the newspapers, right? And the account of his death says that, kind of to everyone's surprise, right before he put his head on the block, to everyone's surprise, he asked for the crucifix and kissed the wounds of Jesus. And so for Therese, that was kind of like the sign. And this Father Loizan, she prayed for him for years, right? I mean, she really focused on his case. And after her death, her sisters wrote to him and shared with him, that she'd been praying for him. And he wrote back and he said, I'm so grateful, right? I appreciate her prayers. And he also died a holy death. It's kind of unconventional, but he died also saying, I love you, Jesus, right? So it's a return to the Lord.
Lauren Sims. Thank you, Lauren.
Hey, thank you so much for such a beautiful presentation. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about Therese's sense of the communion of saints, particularly among the living. And I'm thinking especially of her correspondence with Maurice Bellier,
Yes.
the seminarian, and just her very, very real sense of being connected by grace to all of the souls in the world.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example. I discovered their correspondence, just this past summer, really. It was great food for retreat. But this young seminarian who was really having trouble, hardly was, kind of expelled from one seminary even, and then went to the Congo, and died young, right? But they wrote back and forth, and he grew in trust to her, and he was not withholding, his weakness and sinfulness. And she said, well, don't worry about it. It really doesn't take me by surprise. And then he got worried because he knew she was dying. And he thought, when you get up in heaven and you can see me just as I am from heaven, then you probably won't be as, kind to me, right? As you are now. And she wrote back and she said, I think we have different ideas of heaven. She said, the saints in heaven remember the struggles they had in this life, and therefore they're all the more merciful when they, look down from heaven, if you can call it that. They're all the more merciful because they participate in God's mercy from eternity. Thank you for that question.
Thanks so much. And two last questions. One from Stephanie Schurz and one from Mindlib Dalib. Okay, so maybe Stephanie first.
Hi, Anne. Oh.
Hi, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. I love Therese. And I studied her in Dr. Cavadini's Roads to God. And what I think strikes me about Therese is how she was formed in her holiness. It seemed to me that she was formed in her holiness and in her thought on the communion of saints through her experience in her family. Mm-hmm. And I just loved how she wrote about her experience of going with her father into town and experiencing different people outside of the garden of her family. And I think that she offered that tenderness to others instead of sequestering herself in the safety of her family. She was still able to see the world for what it really was, which was quite a testament to her parents, I thought.
Yes.
Now, Minlib, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, okay, good. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. What do you make of this kind of controversy with Therese in terms of her status as a doctor of the church, given that, she's not Aquinas, she's not all those people who contributed. I won't say that, but that's the controversy, right? She didn't contribute to the theology and spirituality as other doctors of the church. So what I'm asking is, what makes her doctor of the church in your view?
Well, I would like to say the doctrine on the communion of saints, that is, and the little way, when she lived, the very idea that a lay person, could achieve, again, the perfection of Christian life, was not widely upheld. And she herself, entered a Carmelite order, right? The very strictest way of religious life. But the little way that she developed, she was a good Carmelite, but it's very original, right? It's Carmelite, but it's very original. And it's something that was embraced by people upon the publication of Story of a Soul. And they were reading something that they needed to hear, that they weren't hearing from other people, which was that it was enough from God's point of view if you did everything with extraordinary love. So the simplest things that you did in everyday life, the fulfillment of duties, natural love could be transfigured. It presented the gospel in a fresh way, a way that needed to be heard.
All right, thanks.
Thank you so much, Anne. We're really grateful for your talk, and thanks for the questions too. Our third speaker this afternoon is Professor Catherine Cornille of Boston College. Professor Cornille is the Newton College Alumni Chair of Western Culture, and she's a distinguished author with a long list of publications. I had the good fortune to read in a class I taught last year her recent terrific book on comparative theology, talking about the history of the field and its importance in contemporary theological reflection. It's a delight that she's here to give us a talk this afternoon, and so I'll turn it over to Professor Cornille. Thanks so much. Welcome.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Gabriel, for this invitation. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon, and also for the opportunity to focus on the topic I will be speaking about, namely Meister Eckhart across traditions. So I guess I took the topic of the conference very literally in terms of sainthood across religious traditions, and it was a great opportunity for me to look at how Meister Eckhart had been used by thinkers in other religious traditions, and then to think about what does that mean? What can we learn from that ourselves as Christians? So first of all, Meister Eckhart himself, of course, is not recognized as a saint in the Catholic Church, but all of his writings are really about the life of holiness. And so I think he's, in that sense, certainly appropriate to bring up in a conference on sainthood. I was particularly interested, Paul mentions the book on meaning and method in comparative theology, because we tend to always think of comparative theology as a Christian discipline where Christian theologians use elements from other religious traditions. And so this was sort of a double whammy where I could also look at how scholars of other traditions use Christianity and use a particular Christian thinker. And it's true that I don't think that any other Christian thinker has been used by scholars in other religious traditions as much as Meister Eckhart. We could go into the reasons why that is. We probably won't have time for that, but we could go into that maybe in the discussion. Most of you are probably at least vaguely familiar with Eckhart. He was born probably around 1260 in near Erfurt. He joined the Dominican order when he was 14 years old. He studied in Cologne and in Paris, and then he became himself a Lehrermeister and a Lebemeister, so both a professor and a spiritual director. His writings are both in Latin and in German. His more sermons are, for the most part, in German, and his more systematic treatises or commentaries are in Latin. I won't go into the details of his teaching, but I find McGinn's summary of his mystical way really very pointed. He says, it's an invitation for the soul to give up the nothingness of this created self in order to become the divine nothing that is also all things. I think there's a lot that's packed in that understanding of Meister Eckhart's mystical way. His focus is constantly on detachment, on giving up the self or the soul. The words he uses is Gelassenheit or Abgeschiedenheit as a means to God, because in relation to God, the soul is nothing. All created things are nothing in relation to the absoluteness of God. And then God's self is also approached in terms of apophatic theology, of going beyond all names and forms. God is not neither this nor that. He uses those literal words, neither this nor that. God is supra-Trinitarian, if you will, goes beyond the Trinity without negating the Trinity. And then the emphasis of Eckhart is also then on a return to the world. So when he says nothing that is also all things, for him, the highest expression of sainthood is not necessarily retiring from the world, but is in a form of this worldly mysticism. So it's living out of your own deepest ground. The expression he uses is living without a why in this world. That is really the highest expression of saintliness. This is a very, very insufficient summary of some of his work, which I was so grateful for the opportunity to delve into and to immerse myself into this summer. It's really been an incredibly enriching experience. So those are some of his main ideas. Most of you probably know that many of his teachings, not all of his teachings, and not he himself, were condemned in 1329. So 26 of his teachings were condemned in a papal bull in Agro Dominico. Interestingly, partly as a result of his popularity in other religious traditions, the Dominican order has really been pressing the Vatican to vindicate or to reinstate Meister Eckhart as a fully recognized spiritual teacher in the church. And just in 2010, or in the past 10, 20 years, apparently the Vatican answered the head of the Dominican order, that Radcliffe, that it was not necessary to reinstate him because he had never been condemned of heresy himself, or he had never been condemned as a heretic. So I find that kind of unsatisfactory, because we're still sort of hanging with the official verdict on the part of the magisterium of the church on his teaching. So a few things about how he has been used by other traditions. The tradition or the religion that has been most fascinated probably with Eckhart is Buddhism. And this started already in the late 19th century. The thinkers who have focused mostly on him are thinkers of the Buddhist Kyoto school, who are Zen Buddhist philosophers who have been fascinated with Western philosophy and have really focused very intensely on Eckhart's work. So three big thinkers in that school are Nishida Kitaro, Nishitani Keiji, and Ueda Shizuteru, and each of them uses Eckhart to sort of reinforce their own Buddhist teachings. So Nishida Kitaro focuses mostly on the idea of the Godhead beyond God, and a kind of pre-verbal experience that is part of all traditions. But the one who uses Eckhart most, I think, is Nishitani Keiji. And he talks about, when Eckhart talks about the nothingness of creation, that's the same as Buddhist emptiness. When he talks about Abgeschiedenheit, that's the same as the death of the ego in Buddhism. When he talks about living without a why, that's the same as the Buddhist Mahayana emphasis on the sameness of samsara and nirvana. When he talks about the eye with which God sees us is the same as the eye with which we see God, is the same as Buddhist non-duality. So he finds all kinds of resources in Eckhart, and then says, yeah, Eckhart was really not really fully Christian. You know, he was really more of a Buddhist than he was a Christian. Ueda Shizutero also uses Eckhart, and Jim Heisig also notes how he actually interprets the Buddhist ox-herding pictures in the Zen tradition through Eckhart. So here you have a Buddhist Zen philosopher who uses Eckhart to interpret a Buddhist text. Fascinating. I'm sorry I can't go into all the details, but this is, I'll luckily have the chance to develop it more in the paper. And then D.T. Suzuki, the famous Zen master, also points out how similar Eckhart's and Zen's use of language are, going beyond words to get to a deeper reality and so forth. So everything about Meister Eckhart, he says, quote, is singularly Mahayanic or singularly Mahayanistic. So the Buddhist thinkers have been really fascinated with Eckhart, and that has brought about a lot of focus on Eckhart in the dialogue between Buddhism and Christianity. But some Christian thinkers involved in the dialogue also say, well, you know, they don't feel quite comfortable with that, because the way they use Eckhart is like Jan van Bracht and Paul Momar say, Eckhart captivus by Buddhism. So when Eckhart becomes captivated or caught in Buddhism, then he loses his really Christian bearing, and that we have to also recognize the Christian bearing in order to have a fruitful dialogue, because otherwise if you just reduce Eckhart to a Buddhist thinker, then there's really no more need for dialogue. Hindu thinkers, Ananda Kumaraswamy and Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, both of the Advaita Vedanta tradition of which Brad spoke earlier, emphasize both sort of the astonishing parallels between Indian modes of thought, and in particular Advaita Vedanta, of non-duality between the self and the ultimate reality, and the kind of emphasis of Eckhart also between God and the self are not two, so the unity of the deepest self and God is also a central part of his teaching. In Islam, interestingly, so at the time of Eckhart, there was also a lot more engagement between religious thinkers, and Eckhart himself quotes Avicenna repeatedly on detachment, which is one of his central teachings, of course. So he quotes Avicenna, and then nowadays in the 20th century, Muslim thinkers like Fritjof Schuon and Reza Shah Kazemi, both of them you could situate maybe in the perennialist tradition. They both have been fascinated also with Eckhart. And Schuon, in a particular way, he emphasizes that everything, quote, everything that the Holy Scriptures say about Christ is equally true of every man. That's a saying of Eckhart, of course. The birth of the Son in the soul is one of his central teachings, and the difference between Christ and the deepest soul is not always very clear in his writings. So Schuon uses that to say, well, since since Eckhart emphasizes that, the difference between Christ and Muhammad is probably also not very strong, or should not be emphasized in the way it has been in the past. So also, again, part of a kind of perennialist approach. And then Reza Shah Kazemi, who's a contemporary Muslim thinker, also wrote a book on Shankara Eckhart and Ibn Arabi to show how similar they are in terms of their doctrine of transcendence, in terms of the discipline of spiritual ascent, and in terms of the return to the world. So the three steps that one finds in all three thinkers. Then with Judaism, and here I have to thank David Mayan, who's also present here, who helped me find some sources in Judaism. But first of all, you know, like being influenced by Avicenna, Eckhart was also very profoundly influenced by Maimonides. And so you see already the Maimonides' symbolic interpretation of the Bible that comes up, his emphasis on apophatic understanding of the divine reality. Eckhart also recognizes Maimonides' influence on him. So it's not surprising then that just as he was influenced by these Jewish thinkers, some Jewish thinkers would at least recognize some commonality with him. What I found fascinating is Sir Martin Buber, in his early work, at least in one of his letters, writes also about the similarity between the Upanishads, Eckhart, and he focuses in particular on Hasidism and Nachman of Bratslav, to say that they are all talking about the same sort of inner world, which one can behold by withdrawing the hand, as if you normally have your hand. Our normal perception is as if we have a hand in front of the eyes, and when we take it away, we behold the inner world that is ultimately the same, or of which they speak in similar ways in all three traditions. He also talks about the analogy between Eckhart's notion of the birth of God in the soul and the unity between God and the Shekinah in Hasidic and Kabbalistic thought. So later on, though, Buber again emphasizes the difference between Hasidism and Eckhart and other forms of mysticism, and argues that Hasidism is really the only form of mysticism that allows for a full ethical life. I won't go into the details here, but you see some of the ways in which Eckhart has been used by other traditions. I found in Moshe Idel, also the famous scholar of Kabbalah, very few references actually in his work to Meister Eckhart, but at a certain point he does use the term Gelassenheit as sort of the most appropriate term to refer to a state that the mystic attains in Kabbalah. And I was fascinated, David, also why he needed to use the term Gelassenheit. Is there no equivalent term in Kabbalah or in other forms of Jewish mysticism? So that's already a question I have for you. So what do we see in terms of the patterns of how Meister Eckhart has been used? So for the most part, the way he has been used is to reinforce the truth of one's own tradition. So especially the Buddhists and the Hindu scholars who have used Meister Eckhart is to show that he was actually more Buddhist than Christian, but since he's a Christian and so renowned, it shows the truth of Buddhism, or reinforces really the truth of Buddhism. Some use Eckhart to argue for the universality of the ultimate mystical reality, the perennial philosophers, and others will use Eckhart to reinforce the superiority of their own tradition, a bit like some of the Buddhist thinkers did, that Eckhart was really more Buddhist than Christian, and Buddhism is really superior to Christianity. So these are all ways in which Eckhart has been used in other religious traditions. I won't go into the reasons right now why he has been so popular, but what's fascinating to me is also how, because of his popularity in other traditions, he has been reinstated or recovered or rediscovered in Christianity, starting already with Schopenhauer, who was also fascinated by Eckhart, and then Rudolf Otto, who did a big work on comparing Eckhart and Shankara. So some use him, some Christian thinkers have then used him to vindicate him, to reinstate him as an Orthodox Christian mystic. Others have used him just to say, we don't need to go to Buddhism or to Hinduism. We can find some elements of those traditions in our own tradition. And so that's also a way in which Meister Eckhart has been used. what I found really fascinating and what has been really edifying for me is to look at some of his teachings that, you know, are really not part of our Christian education or catechesis or spiritual training. And in particular, I really was fascinated with his teaching on living without a why, and what that can mean in Christian spirituality, and what that can mean for us as lay people also. Because for this teaching is, of course, you know, the teaching that expresses his this worldly spirituality, or his this worldly mysticism, when he compares Mary and Martha. Unlike the tradition as a whole, for him it's Martha who actually is seen as superior, because she lives fully in the spontaneity of living without a why, living in a state of complete selfless activity, complete spontaneous and detached action, living from the ground and acting in the world in this kind of spontaneous way. And, you know, my area of research is mostly on Hinduism and some aspects of Hindu thought. And I've always been fascinated also with the Hindu idea of nishkama karma, or acting without attachment to the fruits of one's action, which is at the heart of the Bhagavad Gita. So it's one of the ways that is emphasized in the Bhagavad Gita, that you also always have to act, you have to work, but the ultimate goal is to act without investing your ego, act without attachment to the fruits of your actions. And it's a teaching that has fascinated me in Hinduism, how one can do that, especially, I mean, you can conceive of it in a context of a caste system, but how one could imagine that in a non-caste context. And so for me, it was really a particular delight to then, you know, go deeper into Meister Eckhart and look at all the ways, all the passages where he talks about disinterested action and living without a why, and how we can realize that in our daily life. And in my search, I also came across ways in which that particular expression is used by figures like Dorothee Sölle. So it's, again, not a world-renouncing kind of spirituality, but Dorothee Sölle, who's, you know, a very famous feminist theologian, liberation theologian in Germany in the past century, and who calls Meister Eckhart her favorite medieval saint or friend. Talks about her own struggles and disappointments in how she tries to engage in social change. And here's a quote of hers: but the rose has no why, and one has to do some things zonder waarom, so without why. Even if they meet with no success now, there's an inner strength of being at peace that cannot make the goal orientation of action the measure of all things. All non-violent action in a violent world participates, in a sense, in the without the why of a rose. So I thought that was just a beautiful quote from Dorothee Sölle that shows also how one can live this kind of spirituality as a layperson in the world today. And so for me, you know, delving into Meister Eckhart and trying to retrieve some of it for our reflection on sainthood in different religious tradition, I think that there's a lot more that can be said about this expression, and also a lot that can be more that can be lived out, but we can go into that in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks so much. Questions that might arise, that fascinating presentation. John Shinkwin.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's fascinating, a figure I didn't know anything about, so I really enjoyed that. I just wanted to ask you about Meister Eckhart as a Christian thinker. It seems that a lot of the ideas that you discussed have a very wide applicability and a very beautiful in a sort of a much broader context. But where does Jesus fit into all of this for Meister Eckhart?
Mm-hmm. So It's a very important and very good question. And several of the articles that were condemned in Agro Domenico were precisely about his emphasis on the continuity between Jesus and the soul. So the birth of the Son in the soul, ultimately, there are many, of his sermons in which it's very hard to distinguish, the birth in the actual historical Son and the birth in our soul, because another aspect of his thinking is that he's very much focused on the eternal now. So the kind of historicity that's part of Christianity plays a very small role. Everything has to be realized in the eternal nu or now. And so I think there is good reason why, some of his teachings were regarded as suspect, but it is always the birth of the Son in the soul. So there's something of the exemplary role of Christ, I think, that still certainly plays in his thinking. He also does mention that we have by grace what Jesus had by nature. And he does talk about the Trinity, even though, we'll ultimately have to go beyond the Trinity in order to attain the fullness of oneness with God and so on. But still, all of those elements are still very much present in his thinking. Now, are they just sort of a matter of you have to base yourself on some symbolic reference point, or do they really make a difference in his thinking? I'll leave that in the middle, but certainly, there is a lot more continuity in his understanding of Jesus and the soul than in most other thinkers, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. David.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And first of all, I can't really answer your question about Moshe Idel without looking at the text inside and knowing what he's referring to. But I would suspect that it wouldn't be that there was a lack of vocabulary in the Kabbalistic texts. Likely the word hishtavut, which would, from the root shaveh, mean equal or absolute equanimity, might be one of the words that would be behind it. But I would suspect that Moshe Idel, as a student of Eliade and as a phenomenologist, is using the word Gelassenheit, because also the word Gelassenheit was, of course, borrowed from Eckhart by Heidegger and entered into Heidegger and his students into phenomenology tradition. And in a sense, phenomenology would be another tradition that you could look at in terms of their reception of Eckhart. And, in a way, the way you spoke about his attentiveness to the inner experience. And then there's also questions of orthodoxy that are raised with that, but it comes from his intense focusing on inner experience. So it's interesting to think about how his ability or his influence in this, whatever phenomenology is, how that popularity and that reception relates to the popularity of other traditions, religious traditions, also in interacting with it or using it.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. Yeah, of course, because the Kyoto School people were also very much influenced by Heidegger, of course. So that's another reference point. Great, thank you very much.
I'm just going to ask a question because it connects to what David was going to say. I was going to ask about Heidegger, but also to kind of talk about, I don't know who made the distinction in French between espoir and espérance, but it's a similar distinction to the one that appeals to you in Eckhart, because according to the thinker who uses the distinction, the one is to live in hope without having a precise goal in mind, and the other is to live in something like hopefulness, openness to kind of what is coming. And in some ways, that's how this French thinker appropriates Heidegger's appropriation of Gelassenheit, with that distinction between espoir and espérance in French. Father John Dunn, who taught here for a number of years until his death in 2013, liked that distinction a lot and urged our students to kind of live with it as they sought to discern their own calling in life. He wanted them not to operate from fear, which can transfix on the nearest thing that seems like it gives us security, but something like an openness to stuff that might still come into their lives to give them direction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Leili.
thank you, Professor Cornille, for the presentation. And I think my question is a more of conceptual question that's probably directed to the three speakers today. So what I catch from the four or probably four, I think, holy people that we talk about today is that this expression of faith and conceptualization of the divine that is much more inclusive and like space opening for all the differences, either it's in religious traditions or in life experience, in the case of Saint Therese, or also like in the way that is detached from the world and also like be in the world. All of the stuff is connected with this quality of opening up the space to others and to differences. Now, but then like what Professor Cornille mentioned in the presentation, when all of the teachings of these holy people that is much more inclusive in nature come into the practical discourse, then the practical discourse tend to use it to justify their own truth or to strengthen the exclusivity that is basically what this opening up spaces going against. So I just want to know the perspectives and opinion from the three speakers. What do you think about this? What do you think about all of these holy people that actually their teachings are for opening up and embracing the differences, but then in the practical discourse, then that kind of teaching being used against its own goal? Thank you.
Thanks, Lily. Before they answer, there is one more question after them. So if Catherine, Anne, and Brad can answer quickly, that'd be great.
I don't know if that's sort of a common reality that their teachings are used against them. It's true that in the case of some Buddhist Zen teachers, they will argue that Eckhart is more Buddhist than Christian and that Buddhism is superior, therefore, to Christianity. On the other hand, I don't know if that's a common, I think most scholars who use these thinkers do emphasize also the kind of universal ground that these thinkers come from and how they can establish sort of connections between different religious traditions. So I wouldn't say that that's a pattern of using them for exclusive purposes. I think the opposite is really rather the case.
Anne? Can't hear you. Yep.
Yeah.
No.
I'm not aware that Saint Therese has ever been discussed, in a kind of context of interreligious dialogue, or that people have even seen this, in her teaching. She's regarded as, kind of like, it's like a very Catholic saint, very of a Victorian era in some ways, very much a child, of her own, her own locality in France in the 19th century. But on the other hand, like all the saints, they have this, they have something because of their connection to God that, extends beyond that, right? And that becomes a kind of a universal. But I was thinking that what, in the case of her, that she's very apophatic in a way that I hadn't really thought about, until I was thinking about also Meister Eckhart and the two of them together, because she posits that each one's salvation depends on the good of another, right? And that this will only be known to us in heaven. And so there's this openness, that this reality is here with us already now, but that only God, will it be the one who will let us to see, to see the goodness in others, in all souls, as He does, right? And so that each tradition, as it draws closer to God, is also drawing closer to that revelation and appreciation of the beauty of all the holy souls. So, but it's actually very orthodox with what she teaches, and so I think this kind of conversation that we're having will, I think, help us also to appreciate her teaching in a deeper way, more complex way than we recognized before.
Brad, do you have anything you'd like to add? Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm not even completely sure I understood the question, but let me say a few rambling things here based on what I've heard in response. Yeah, just real quick. Ramakrishna and Ramana Maharshi are not controversial within Hinduism. I think that Ramakrishna rather is seen by Hindus as a sign that Hinduism has a greater awareness of the truth than other religions do, and Ramakrishna is just one example of that. He lives at what they already believe, you know. With Ramana Maharshi, there has been some reaction against what people do with his spirituality today in the West. Basically, the problem is not Ramana Maharshi. He didn't do anything wrong. Of course, he goes away from the tradition by opening up his teachings beyond the traditional preparations that you're supposed to follow in order to reach the final goal. But people nowadays in the West have been faulted for mimicking his silence when his silence comes out of a rich awareness, whereas they're just being tricky and trying to be clever, and they don't really have that depth. And so they don't really appreciate what he's doing. They haven't really undergone the inner depth. And so we find a lot of wannabe Ramana Maharshis today in the West who really don't come out of that same depth of spirit that he himself is doing. So that's what's going on now is the reactions both for and against what he represents in the realm of spiritual development. I'll just say that much, and that's enough.
Thanks, Brad.
Yeah.
And the final question will be from Father George Ike, who's coming to us from Owerri, Nigeria. George.
Okay, thanks, Prof. I want to ask the last lecturer this particular question. You said something on living without a why, and you cited Martha as the example of someone who lived without a why. So I'm trying to ask, I know that the few places we saw Martha in the scriptures, she was actually the one who was asking the questions. Like when Christ came to her house and she was the one cooking, she was the one who asked the question, why have you kept quiet? My sister is here and you don't know how to come and help me. And then even the second time during the time of the death of Lazarus, she was the one who asked the question, Lord, if you were here, my brother would not have died, which is another way of asking, why didn't you come on time? So I'm trying to find out. You said she's an example of someone who lived without a why. So, or is it the other way around?
So,
thank you.
Thank you for that question. And, you know, it's not my invention. It's Meister Eckhart who uses her as the example. And if you read the sermons, like just read Sermon 9, where Meister Eckhart talks about the wife who was a virgin. There he talks about Martha and her activity. So he consciously reverses the idea that Mary had the better position, and says that in fact Mary was not quite developed enough to just continue to living in the kind of spontaneous Gelassenheit that Martha had. Martha was actually more mature than Mary, because Mary still had to sit at Jesus' feet and learn from Jesus and so on. And that, you know, the way Jesus mentions the name Martha twice has to do sort of with, so it's his interpretation, of course. I'm not saying that this is a true interpretation, but that's his interpretation of the relationship between Mary and Martha, and where he tries to emphasize the importance of kind of spontaneous being in the world without sort of investing your own desire for its outcome in the activity. It's a very rich, but I think also quite dangerous idea that I would really love to work on more. I think it's a beautiful idea if the the purity of, if your action is indeed pure, but it can also become demonic if you're doing certain types of action without a why. Anyway, so I think it does require an original intentionality and an original purity of vocation, if you will, or of activity in order to live that out in its fullness. But again, it's Meister Eckhart's idea, certainly, it's not mine. But read Sermon 9, it's a short sermon, and that'll give you the fullness of his thoughts.
Thank you very much, Professor Cornille and Professor Astell and Professor Malkovsky. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this second session. We're really grateful for your participation and grateful especially to our presenters. We look forward to seeing you in a week. And thank you very much. Enjoy the weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Gabriel.
Thank you. Bye.
Everybody.
All right, it's a break from this book. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.